The studio lights always came on before the sun, a quiet ritual that had defined most of Craig Melvin's adult life, but on certain mornings, especially the ones after heavy news cycles, those lights felt less like illumination and more like interrogation. They asked him, silently and relentlessly, how a person could carry so many stories and still appear steady to millions of viewers who began their day with his voice. Craig had long understood that reporting the news meant bearing witness, yet what surprised him over the years was how some stories refused to remain confined to the teleprompter or the broadcast archive. They followed him home, lingered in quiet corners of memory, and surfaced unexpectedly during ordinary moments, pouring coffee, tying his shoes, watching the first pale streaks of morning through the kitchen window. That morning was one of those mornings. The previous evening's segment had been about a small-town tragedy, the kind that never made national headlines for long, but carved permanent spaces in the hearts of those who lived it. Craig had delivered the report with the practiced composure of a seasoned journalist, but the images, an empty playground, a mother's trembling voice, the silence of a street that had once echoed with laughter, had lodged somewhere deeper than he intended. Now, hours later, the weight of it remained. Quiet, but insistent. He sat at the kitchen table in the stillness before dawn, staring into his coffee as if it might offer answers, when Lindsay Charniak walked in, wrapped in the soft familiarity of a morning robe and the easy understanding that comes from years of shared routines. She didn't ask immediately what was wrong. She rarely did. Instead, she poured herself coffee and sat across from him, the two of them suspended in that gentle quiet that long marriages learn to treasure. "One of those stories?" she finally asked, her voice soft enough not to disturb the calm. Craig nodded slowly. "The kind that sticks," he said. For a man whose career had been built on telling other people's stories, he had always found it strangely difficult to talk about the effect those stories had on him. But Lindsay knew the signs, the thoughtful pause, the distant gaze, the subtle shift in his voice. Over the years, she had watched him return from assignments carrying invisible luggage, the grief of families, the resilience of communities, the quiet courage of people who faced unimaginable moments. "You know," she said gently, "the reason they stay with you is the same reason people trust you to tell them." Craig considered that for a moment. When he first entered journalism decades earlier, he believed professionalism meant emotional distance. The best reporters, he thought, were those who could observe tragedy without absorbing it. But time had taught him something different. The stories that mattered most, the ones that truly connected with viewers, were often the ones that touched him too. Not in a dramatic or visible way, but in a quiet, enduring sense of responsibility. Those stories reminded him that behind every headline was a life, a family, a moment that changed everything. And as the years passed, he realized that the emotional weight he carried was not a flaw in the profession, it was part of its humanity. Lindsay watched him thoughtfully, recognizing the familiar rhythm of reflection. Their life together had been built around unpredictable schedules, early mornings, and the constant hum of news cycles. Yet moments like this, simple conversations before sunrise, formed the steady center that balanced everything else. "You've told thousands of stories," she said, "but the ones that stay with you, those are the ones that remind people they're not alone." Craig leaned back slightly, letting the words settle. He thought about the viewers who had watched the broadcast the night before, people in living rooms across the country, some nodding quietly, others remembering their own experiences with loss or resilience. News, at its best, wasn't just about information, it was about connection. It helped strangers understand one another's lives, even for a few minutes. That realization had become more meaningful as he grew older, particularly as the pace of life seemed to accelerate around him. In a world that often felt louder and more divided, the simple act of listening to someone's story, to their grief, to their hope, felt quietly profound. Outside, the sky had begun to shift from deep navy to the faintest shade of gray. Morning was arriving. Craig glanced at the clock and realized the day's broadcast was only hours away. Soon he would be back under the studio lights, guiding viewers through the day's headlines with calm clarity. Yet something about this quiet conversation had softened the heaviness he'd carried since the previous night. "You know," he said with a small smile, "I used to think the goal was to leave the stories at work." Lindsay raised an eyebrow. "And now?" Craig looked out the window, watching the first streak of sunlight brush against the horizon. Now, I think the goal is just to carry them with care. Lindsay reached across the table and squeezed his hand, a simple gesture that spoke more than any long speech could. After all these years, she understood something that Craig himself had only recently begun to articulate. The stories that never left him were also the stories that had shaped him, made him more patient, more attentive, more aware of the quiet resilience that exists in ordinary lives. And perhaps that was the quiet truth behind the long mornings, the late-night broadcasts, and the countless voices he had listened to over the years. Journalism was never just about reporting events, it was about honoring the moments that mattered to people. Craig stood, gathering his jacket and notes, feeling the familiar mixture of responsibility and gratitude that accompanied each new broadcast day. As he headed toward the door, Lindsay called after him with a warm smile. "Just remember, some stories stay because they're meant to." Craig paused, nodding thoughtfully before stepping into the early morning light, ready once again to tell the world stories, even the ones that would quietly follow him home.